My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, I want to talk about something that most people think that they've left behind. What I've been seeing, and trust me, this cuts across a lot of areas: relationships, dating, kink, even just how people move through their day to day life, is how much behavior is still shaped by the expectation of being judged. Not actual judgment here, not someone directly saying something, the expectation of it. And it shows up in small ways at first: pausing before you say something, or even changing it, holding back a little bit because you're not going to, you're not too sure how it's going to land. Or maybe you just agree a little bit faster than you need to, just to keep everything smooth. And from the outside, this looks like awareness. It looks like social calibration, if you will. And it passes for the most part. But before I go into this any further, I want to do what I do every week. I want to say thank you to all of you who keep listening and sharing the show, reaching out about these conversations. I read all of your messages. I hear all of your comments, good, bad, and indifferent, everything in between. If you're new here, welcome. Glad you found your way in, right? If you find that the show has been helpful to you and you're listening to me, for example, on Spotify, do me a favor. If you're on the app, go over to where the Kink Perspective is, hit those three little dots, rate the show 5 stars. This allows other people to find it. On YouTube, like, subscribe. That way you're going to know when new shows drop, right? I'm still working out why it's getting stuck behind the privacy wall. I do make it public for those of you who like to listen on YouTube, and I am on Apple and other streaming services, right? This just allows people to keep finding the show and hearing the things they need to hear. If you do want to support the work directly, there is a link in the show's description, right? That support keeps all these conversations going. All right, let's get back to it now. Now, when you stay with these feelings a little longer, you start to see something else. Now, this adjustment you start to make, this isn't occasional. It starts to become your default behavior. All of your decisions get filtered before they're even expressed. Reactions get managed in real time. And there's this everything we start doing becomes a calculation running underneath most of our interactions. And most people think they grew out of this somewhere in high school. That is the part of being younger, right? We try to fit in, figuring out where we're going to land, what cliques or groups or teams we need to belong to. Unfortunately, that didn't stop. It just changed its form now in adulthood. So what I want to do today is slow all of this down and look at what this pattern actually is, where it starts, and why it carries so far into adulthood without even being questioned. Because once you start to see it clearly, it becomes harder to ignore how much of it is still shaping how people think, how they speak, and how we connect with each other. So first, let's start with what this is and where it begins, right? Let's get clear on what actually this is, right? Because if you don't define it properly, it just turns into this vague idea about insecurity or people pleasing, and that misses a lot of this completely. This is not just caring what people think. This is organizing your behavior around what you think people will think before that even happens. We would otherwise know this as anticipation. You're not responding to their feedback, you're adjusting in advance. You're running a version of the interaction in your head and trying to predict what the outcome is going to be or their reaction, and then you are shaping yourself to manage that outcome. Now, most of that happens quickly enough that it feels natural, like you're just being socially aware. But there's a difference between awareness and dependence. And awareness means you can read the room and understand the context and still choose how you show up. Dependence means how you show up is decided by that room. And that's the difference. When it becomes dependence, your behavior is no longer anchored internally, it's anchored to perception. You're not asking, what do I think? You're asking, how's this going to land? And over time, that becomes the default filter. Now, this doesn't just start in adulthood, it starts early. And for most people, we get locked into this pattern in high school, right? High school is one of the first environments where social feedback carries a lot of real weight for us. Status, acceptance, rejection, attention, all of it is visible and immediate. and overwhelming. You say something and people are going to react. You dress a certain way, people notice. You step outside of what's expected and there's a response. So people learn very quickly, right? And you couple all this with emerging hormonal patterns and behavioral patterns and feelings, it's amplified, right? Love, anger, sadness, they all feel grandiose in some sort of way. So, through all this is where people learn what gets approval, what gets ignored, what gets judged. And once that mapping starts, behavior adjusts around it. Now, you see it in how people speak, right? They'll soften their opinions, they mirror a group, right? You see it in how people present themselves, their clothes, their posture, their tone. You see it in what they don't say and what they hold back because it might not land very well with some people. That adjustment isn't random, it's functional. At that stage, approval starts to feel like safety. If you're accepted, you're included. And if you're included, you're in a stable environment, right? If you're outside of that, things get uncertain really fast, really quick. So people adapt here. They manage visibility. They learn when to stand out and when to pull back. They start reading a room before they speak, before they act, before they take any kind of social risk. And it works. That's the part that matters. It's not a broken system in that environment, it's effective. It helps people navigate something that can be unpredictable and at times hostile. So the behavior gets reinforced, not in some overt way, just through repetition. It smooths interactions, it avoids any type of friction, and it helps keeps things quite stable. The problem is not that it starts, the problem is that it never gets reevaluated. There's no clear point where most people stop to ask, hey, do I still need to operate this way? They just carry it forward. It becomes more refined over time, less obvious, more controlled. Instead of obvious conformity, it turns into all of these small adjustments we start making. Instead of changing who you are, it becomes editing. You trim certain parts of yourself, you emphasize others, and that way you can keep things within a range that feels acceptable to you. So, what do? We read the room, right? We're not just reading it, we're better at it. Then you start to adjust, and it doesn't just feel as noticeable in the beginning because now it's getting quieter and it doesn't get questioned. So by the time someone reaches adulthood, this pattern is often fully integrated into their lives. It doesn't feel like it's a strategy anymore. It feels like personality. This is just how you are. You're careful, considered, you're easy to get along with, and you really don't get involved in conflict. But underneath that, the same system is running. Anticipate the reaction, adjust your behavior, and maintain stability. There's no real transition out of it. There's no moment where people are taught how to separate awareness from dependence. They just improve the system, right? And the worst part about that is they've just building on what they already have. So instead of actually asking themselves, what do I want here? The question stays the same, just more refined. How will this be received? And when that question sits underneath most of our decisions, most interactions or our expressions, it starts shaping more than just your behavior. It shapes your identity. Because if you consistently adjust yourself based on anticipated judgment, anticipated judgment over time, it gets harder to tell what is actually yours and what your behavior's been shaped into. And that's where it starts to move out of something situational into something structural. It's no longer about movement at all, right? It's about how someone organizes themselves. So now let's get this into all right, Chris, I got the setup now. We're talking about high school and we understand this behavior and how it shapes us. Absolutely. So what's the adult version and how does this fit into our psychological range? That's such a great question that I got asked. As this pattern of behavior moves into adulthood, it doesn't go away. It becomes harder to see, right? Because by this point, it's sitting inside of how people speak, how they hesitate, change direction mid sentence. Now, all of this outside appearance looks controlled, thoughtful, maybe even looks like you're being mature. But what's actually happening is that expression is being filtered before it ever fully comes out. Communication becomes indirect, vague, right? People stop saying things clearly. They will soften, redirect, leave space so they don't have to fully stand on what they mean or be non-committal. And you can hear the split if you slow it down completely. There's what they want to say, and then there's what actually comes out in the first place. The first version is usually clear, direct, and definitely already formed. The second version is adjusted. It gets trimmed, padded, and reshaped so it lands in a way that's not going to create any real reaction they don't want to deal with. The gap isn't small here, right? Especially in that moment, but it's there. And once it's there, it's going to keep showing up. The motivation shifts here. Now, earlier, it's about being liked. Now it's about avoiding being judged, avoiding tension, avoiding being seen in a way that creates pressure. The goal is not connection, it's stability. Keep the interaction smooth, right? Don't let it turn. That's what's driving the behavior. Now, if you stay inside one of those moments, you can feel it. There's a pause before speaking, right? We're starting to check ourselves. You're going to ask internally, God, is this going to land okay? They're going to be upset that I said that. Then the decision comes. We might adjust what we say. We say it in a way that keeps things, steady and calm, right? And once it's said, then we check again internally. We're looking at the reactions. Did that land okay? Are they shifting? If they did, I'm going to have to adjust again. If it didn't, I have to settle just for that second. Then I'm going to move forward. And that process happens real fast, but it's constant. Now, underneath that, the structure is simple. External referencing becomes the way someone regulates themselves. Instead of holding on to a steady internal position, they look outward. They track their reactions, right? They look at tone, timing, facial expressions, and even silence. All of it gets read and used to decide what happens next. The internal state here is tied directly to what comes back. If the response feels neutral or positive, things are going to be calm. If it shifts even a little bit, that internal state is going to shift with it. So the mechanism here stays consistent. Anticipate what might happen. Adjust your behavior before it does. Get a response that keeps things stable. That stability is temporary, though, because when it changes, the process is going to repeat. Anticipate, adjust, settle, over and over and over again. There is no point where a person is just expressing and letting it land. The adjustment is always built in. And let me give you an example here. About a week ago, I knew there was going to be a contention point in something I said, but it's not a hill I have to die on. It's something true. And I talked about BDSM not being a therapeutic modality because it's not, and it's also not a regulatory tool. Now, I didn't adjust. I didn't look for people's tone in the room. I didn't, I discussed this calmly with 300 different comments coming at me. But the reality was, I'm not looking for other people's judgment to rule my life. I said what I said, and I stand behind it. And I do this when I work with people or I talk about other writings. I'm very clear because external judgment doesn't drive me. But it has taken me a while to get here. That's not because I'm getting older and don't care. I still care, but I'm very careful in what I say. I've been around. It's calculated. I know from experience and reading things what I'm going to say and how it's going to land. I anticipate a little bit of pushback, but that's okay. I'm always open for the discourse. But a lot of people aren't comfortable with that. Once pushback begins, the adjustment begins. Why? Because they don't want the judgment. And here you start to see the cost of all of this when that gap becomes the internal and then what's expressed doesn't close, right? Those two things don't get closer, just stays there. And that gap is small at first, then it becomes more noticeable over time, right? Because now you're looking at someone leaves a conversation and they start thinking about what they didn't say or how they should have said something differently than they meant it. And this isn't some big overt shift. It's just there. And then it happens again and again in every interaction thereafter. And that's where someone's identity starts to shift. And it's not clear, but it's in a very gradual one grain of sand at a time. So if you keep adjusting yourself based on how something might be received, and over time it becomes harder to separate what is actually yours from what has been shaped. So the question of what do I want or what do I think doesn't disappear, it just gets smaller, not as loud anymore. And it gets replaced with what fits here, what's going to work here, and what will hold this interaction in place with one person or many. So, what does this do? It creates this kind of uncertainty that doesn't always get named. Decisions don't feel as clear. Our preferences are less defined, not because they aren't there, but because they've been running through that filter for so long, they don't come through clean anymore. So, you see patterns clearly in behavior. People test instead of stating. They put something out halfway and wait to see how it lands before committing to it. We could do this or not. It's fine. I don't really mind either way. Now, that sounds flexible when we make that kind of statement, right? It's easy, but it avoids being known and it avoids putting something down clearly enough that it can be responded to directly. There are parts that don't get said at all, not because they don't exist, but because they might not land so well. So they get contained, they're managed, right? They get presented in a way that's not going to shift the interaction too much. Control is still present, but it's shifted. It's no longer about controlling behavior or outcomes directly. It's about controlling perception, managing how you're seen so the interaction doesn't turn. And once that version is completely established, it just has to be maintained. And then you stay in that lane. And you're not going to deviate too far out of it. You're not going to too far left or right because that's going to risk any type of different reaction. And that reaction is what the whole system is built to avoid. That pressure sits quietly, but it's definitely there. It's consistent and it's readable. So what do? We keep it within that parameter, that range, right? We don't go too far one way or another outside of our lanes. And this is where it lands. The interaction feels smooth and it's easy. There's no real tension, right? Nothing's wrong, but it's managed. So what is being shown has already been adjusted before it even reaches the other person. What is being said is not fully what's there, and it has already been shaped to fit somebody else's reaction that we don't even know if they're going to react. We're just judging. We're guessing at how they are going to interpret and judge us. And over time, that creates a whole lot of distance. Not in a way that is going to stop or break things immediately, but in a way that keeps something from fully forming. So, how does this tie together with relationships and kink and our overall performance? This starts to show up most clearly in our relationships because that's where the stakes feel a whole lot higher and we're definitely more exposed. People are not interacting from a clean place. They're presenting versions of themselves that have already been adjusted, not completely false, but not completely true either. Certain parts are emphasized, others are held back. What gets shown is what feels safe to show. It affects how people communicate, right? Instead of saying something directly, they soften it or delay it. Instead of addressing any type of tension, they move around it. Conflict doesn't get engaged with cleanly because it risks judgment. Judgment risks shifting the dynamic, so it gets avoided or managed. The interaction then is made to stay smooth on the surface, but the clarity underneath is never fully formed. And that's where alignment starts to become surface level. It just looks like agreement. And it looks like things are just working. And it's all built on things that have never been said. So all of these decisions get made without real full input. That way we keep less friction. But without the friction, there's no depth. And over time, that creates a gap between what the relationship looks like and what's actually happened inside of it. And you can see the same pattern carrying into our kink and our power dynamics, right? We get into our roles, and those roles are shaped by what they think will be validated, accepted, what will be seen as correct. And instead of stating, or starting from what is actually here, they start from what will land well. And dominance and submission start to get performed instead of held. The language is there, right? The posture is, even the structure. But underneath all of that is the same pattern that's still running. Anticipate how this will be seen, adjust your behavior to match that expectation, and then maintain the role in what way that keeps the interaction stable. This is not about whether or not the role is right or wrong. It's about whether or not what is actually driving it. Someone can be dominant or submissive position here and still be operating from the same place of external referencing. The role doesn't change the mechanism. It just gives it a different form. That's where the distinction between negotiation and performance starts to matter, right? Negotiation is direct. It involves stating what we want, not want, what might come up that we can't anticipate, right? I call it the X factor, what works and what doesn't. This part requires us to be clear and the ability to hold that clarity, even if the response is not what is expected. Performance, though, that's different. It stays within what feels acceptable. It adapts in real time to maintain that interaction. It avoids anything that might disrupt how the dynamic is being perceived. It can look structured and it's reactive underneath. When performance is driving the interaction, behavior is shaped for an entire audience, even if the audience is only one other person. The focus here shifts from what's actually happening between these two people to how that interaction is being received in the moment, right? So, guess what? We stay in the range, we don't push, we don't create a reaction that can't be managed. That changes the dynamic in a small way. It keeps it stable, but it limits what it actually can develop. Why? Because there's less risk, but there's also less honesty. So we're holding the connection, but we're not really going any deeper because if we did, we don't have the capacity for the adjustment that wasn't there in the first place. And because it still functions on the surface, it often doesn't get questioned. It just becomes how the relationship operates. So, what does this cost? This is where the cost starts to show. It doesn't show all at once, right? There's no big band coming out and telling you, all right, this is what this is what's now in the warranty. It's going to build over time. So the first place it's going to show up is clarity. If you're constantly adjusting yourself based on how something might be perceived, then it becomes harder to tell what's actually yours. Preferences feel less defined, decisions take longer. There's a second layer on everything. You check it, you filter it, you pause, you refine it, you take away what you weren't going to say, you put back in things that are going to probably land a little bit better. Not because the answer isn't there, but because it's been running through the same thing over and over, right? Before it's allowed to actually come out. And all this does is create a internal noise. We're monitoring ourselves, we're adjusting, we're tracking, we're watching how what we say lands or shifts or needs to be corrected. And it doesn't stop when the interaction ends either. It just carries forward. Then we start replaying all of these conversations in our mind. We think about what we said, what wasn't said, what could have been said differently. And that just stays active in the background. And when we amplify that and move that into relationships, then we look at it as showing lack of depth. Things can look stable, even consistent, but then we know something's missing. The interaction we get is fine, it's smooth, but it's not direct. It's partially direct. So these people or couples or anybody else are only engaging in versions of themselves, right, that have been shaped to fit the moment. Over time, that just is going to create distance. And that distance isn't subtle. People stay connected. They spend their time together, talk, share parts of themselves, future plans, financial worries, whatever. But there's a point where something doesn't get said, or it doesn't fully land. And something doesn't fully reach the other person. Not always, obvious, but it's definitely felt. People then wake up to the realization they don't they don't feel fully known. Not because the other person isn't paying attention, but because what's being shown isn't complete. It's curated. It's diluted because we just kept it in a range so things could stay stable. And that stability comes at a cost. It limits our exposure because through protection. But guess what? It also limits your experience. If something never gets said cleanly, it can't be responded to cleanly. If you always make something soft, it's never going to fully show up. If we hold parts of ourselves back, those parts never become integrated into the dynamic. The relationship just stays within what is a manageable range so I don't go outside of my lanes, not what can it be possible of evolving into. And that carries across everything, not just relationships, our decisions, our opportunities, our friendships, our family, how we move through our lives. If everything gets filtered first, then a lot of things never get a chance to exist in a direct way. And most of this doesn't shift by trying to force change. It doesn't come from deciding to be more honest or more direct in some broad way. That usually just creates more pressure, which then, guess what, feeds the same pattern. That shift starts somewhere smaller, maybe just by noticing. Not after the fact, not when you're replaying it later, but in the moment when you feel that pause, you can catch yourself adjusting something before you set it. You'll notice when you're starting to soften something, and it's just like automatic, like breathing. You just notice it. You don't need to correct it, not, forcing it into a different reaction, just seeing it as it happens. Because most people never track it in real time. It just kind of runs like a computer system. Once you start to see it, even in small moments, it becomes harder to ignore how often it's there. This is what we call pattern recognition. But a lot of times, it's just our operating system. So we don't question it. So this becomes very simple. How much of what you do is actually yours? As I wind this down for you all today, this isn't something that needs to be eliminated to zero. It's not possible. People are always going to be aware of each other. There are always going to be some level of adjustment in how we interact, right? I'm not going to go and meet a politician or in my flip flops and start burping and drinking beers and stuff. It doesn't matter if that's not wouldn't be professional of me, right? There's always going to be some small inner adjustment or levels of adjustment in how we interact with people, right? Putting our best foot forward. That's part of being social. That's not the issue of what I'm talking about. The issue is when that adjustment becomes the foundation of the interaction, when it moves from something you can use to something that just runs you. Because once that happens, you don't really get a clean contact anymore. You get a controlled version of it. You get all of your interactions that hold together, but none of them are fully open, right? You're trying to maintain stability, but that's built on management instead of something that can actually carry any weight. And most people can function like that for a very long time. That's why it's easy to miss. It doesn't break things immediately. It just keeps them within a certain range. Safe, predictable, contained. Nothing pushes too far. Nothing gets exposed. And for a while, that can feel like it's working. But over time, it just starts to narrow things. And this even goes to the show that I spoke to last week when I was talking about men and positions of power. It wasn't an attack on men. It was just pointing out more so to my comment about somebody that I addressed in a comment to them about things they were saying. They kept everything in a safe range. They didn't like things being disrupted. So what do? They didn't challenge my comment. They just deleted it. I didn't attack them. I questioned things they were saying. It made them uncomfortable. It made them stay in their lane. That's fine, right? What you say, what you try to do, what you allow yourself to move toward, it all starts within what can be managed instead of what might actually matter to you. That's where people start feeling stuck without being able to point to why. Not because something is obviously wrong here, but because something is consistently being held in place. This isn't about pushing yourself into something extreme or forcing some kind of radical shift. It's about being clear on what's actually driving how you move, whether you're responding to the moment or are you shaping yourself around it to what you think it needs to be. That's the difference that matters more than most people realize. So, the question I'm going to let you sit with this week: when you look at how you speak, decide, or show up with others, where are you adjusting before anything even happens? All right. Big question. I'm loving all the comments and the emails coming in. I'm glad the show helps. It's okay for those of you who are listening that email me privately and say, I don't want to comment publicly. You're fine. Love hearing it. Comment on you can comment on social media. You can comment on Spotify directly, YouTube. I read it all. You can send me an email. Email address is here. Let me get to a couple of other things that are coming up. All right. I'm going to address something really quickly. Why my aim is, and I've said this, I'm pretty clear about it, but I don't know why. I get this question a lot. Why my AMA is, do I not address therapeutic questioning? Because I can't. That's just a simple answer. I'm not going to go into it because I've covered this about 100 times before. I just can't, right? It's not what I can do. So I'm not going to answer it. If you see the response from me that, this leans into therapeutic territory, that's exactly what it is. Number two, I want to be very clear on something before I wrap this up today. Just a very quick note. Over the next few weeks, I don't know when it's going to begin yet, I'm going to be bringing in a sponsor into my show. It's not major, right? It's going to keep in line with how I do things here. There's not going to be a deviation, right? It's just going to be, it's just part of keeping this ongoing. Okay. So I just want to put that out there so you all don't think I just sprung it on you. Surprisingly, Chris, where's this coming from? Right. Well, I've got things I got to take care of too. Right. So I'm very happy. I will announce who that sponsor is. I've been going through, it's been a lot of back and forth, and I'm very happy. But I'll leave it at that for now. Okay. Yes, I do have a book out there. You can find it. Tangled Desires, The Intersection Between Psychology and BDSM. It's a good book. It's not a great book, but it does explain at the, your core level. It is a little repetitious. It's a little clinical. I do apologize for that. First book I ever actually wrote. Most therapists do that same stuff too. If you have a heavy psych background, you write heavily in psychology because that's what you think needs to deliver to be more serious. But that's why the book's inexpensive. I am working on two books. One is a fiction book. I'm a lot closer to that being done because that's been something I've been working on for years. It's nothing to do with the lifestyle. But yes, am I writing another book? I am. I don't have a working title. All I have is a word, and that word is masks, right? The masks we wear. That's it. That's not going any, don't over and interpret what I'm saying right now. I don't know where I'm going with it. I've got my brainstorming going, but yes, it is coming. I am working on it. Probably going to take me, I don't know, because I don't have as much time and I don't do a lot of the same levels of research at the same amount that other people do. So it's going to take me a little bit more time. I promise it won't be as clinical, and I do promise it will not be as repetitious. All right. It'll be a better book. All right. I'll stop book shaming myself for somebody who I met once who said, stop book shaming yourself. So I'm not going to do that. Okay. That being said. So back to today. We're going to go back to the question. I want to see you all again. Talk about this in the comments. I do. I want to see you all because I know this is something we all do. I'm guilty of it, right? But when we get older, we can either stay stuck in this pattern or we move on from it, right? It's not a condemnation, but I am asking for you to notice. That's it. So here's the question again, one last time. When you look at how you speak, decide, or show up with other people, where are you adjusting before even anything happens? That's the question to sit with, right? Put that in the socials. Let me know what you think about today. Talk about this. Drop me an email. Until next time, everybody, be safe and stay kinky.